Joe Larsen recently completed his Master Gardener of Northern Virginia class and is currently an intern. He has lived in Arlington, Virginia for 23 years. He has over 10 years of vegetable gardening experience and has been using hydroponic systems for the last 8 years. He has experience with deep water culture, ebb and flow, and aeroponic systems. He has experience setting up indoor growing spaces and has cultivated multiple vegetable species using hydroponics. A scientist by training, he earned his PhD in microbiology and immunology at the Uniformed Services University and a BA in microbiology at the University of Kansas. Thanks, Joe. I'm going to hand it over to you now.
Thanks, Nicole, and welcome everybody. I'm really excited to be here today and to talk about all things hydroponics. I think for those of you that don't have any experience, my goal today is for hopefully to get you inspired to try this as a growing methodology. And we'll go through ways that you could set up your own systems. We'll talk about different types of systems, go through kind of the pros and cons, the do's and don'ts. I will say up front, there's elements of this discussion that can veer into some pretty technical material. And I think the purpose of that is not to overwhelm you or to have this be intimidating and something that you can't do, but instead is to try to provide you with a knowledge base to be able to troubleshoot potential problems should you encounter them. So overview, we'll go through a little bit of a brief history of hydroponics, and then we'll discuss some of the principles involved, and then go through various types of hydroponic systems that one could use to particularly cultivate vegetables or other plants. We'll go through some pros and cons of hydroponics, different systems, commercially available ones versus kind of DIY or do-it-yourself systems. We'll go through the equipment that you would need. I've tried to generate a comprehensive list of equipment that you would need. You probably won't need all those things to get started, and I'll try to point out where those differences lie, and then go through some of the problems that you may encounter in terms of pests and pest management and different ways that you can address them. What is hydroponics? In general, hydroponics is a way of growing plants in a liquid nutrient solution. There's various different types of medium that you use that basically take the place of soil in terms of providing that physical structure and support for the plant so that it can remain vertical and grow. This is a really powerful way, I would say, in addition to being viable, at really increasing the amount of vegetables that you can harvest, as well as generating success with a variety of different ornamental crops. You know, it's funny, every time I've ever grown something hydroponically first and then moved it out into my soil garden, I'm usually disappointed with the results I see in the soil garden compared to what I'm able to generate doing hydroponics. And I have some pictures of various vegetable species that I've cultivated hydroponically in this presentation, and I think you'll see the robustness of the growth related to this method. Everything that we're going to talk about in terms of the ideal conditions to setting up and growing hydroponically is really centered all around optimization. And I don't think that that's really fundamentally different than what you do in a soil garden, right? The various practices of fertilizing or caring or pruning or taking care of plants is all about trying to optimize that end result, right? Which is, you know, in the case of vegetables, you know, trying to increase yield, increase harvest, increase the quality of the product that you're producing. And the same can be said with hydroponics. And so in some of the technical issues we'll get into, do you have to do those things in order to be a successful hydroponic gardener? Probably not all of them. But doing all those things and understanding the principles behind them will allow you to grow vegetable plants and other plants hydroponically in a really optimized way. Hydroponics relies on the same basic principles as soil gardening, and you can see this depicted in this schematic on the right. With soil, you have kind of inorganic and organic material that is in the soil. And through the action of microbes, those products are decomposed. And basically, it's the decomposed minerals that end up dissolved in the soil water that creates the soil solution that basically feeds your plants and provides it all of the macro and micronutrients that are necessary for growth and fruit and vegetable production. In hydroponics, it's just basically a simplification of that form. Basically, those same micro and macronutrients are simply dissolved in water. And the water then becomes a nutrient solution that then contacts the plant's roots and promotes growth. We'll talk about media in a second, but all of the plants that are grown hydroponically use some sort of supporting media. And what that does is help keep the plant in place and allows it to still maintain its physical structure and root structure, which then allows it to grow. Obviously, both of these systems needs water to grow. That's not, I think an earth-shattering fact to anybody. And then also, right, you know about pH and soil. You know that the effect that pH has on the ability of plants to take up both micro and macronutrients in soil. And the same can be held true with hydroponics. And I would just say, as a general principle, while hydroponics is more robust in terms of being able to produce more yield and outcomes for plants, it is also, to a certain extent, much more sensitive to these types of differences. To whereas a difference in pH in a hydroponic system will have a much more profound negative or positive impact on your outcome than maybe some differences in pH within a soil system. A little bit about the history of hydroponics for those that are history buffs. The word comes from two Greek words meaning hydro means water, ponos means labor. The method, I should say, not the word, was first used in 1929 by Dr. Gurecki, who was a California-based professor that basically converted what had previously been a laboratory technique into a commercial means of growing plants. And interestingly, the US Army used hydroponics to grow fresh food for troops that were stationed in the Pacific Campaign during World War II. And then by the 1950s, there was commercial farms all over the world. And even here today, and I'll reference and provide some materials later for those of us in Northern Virginia, there are in fact some local hydroponic farms that are in operation even in Arlington, Virginia. This is a picture of that Dr. Gurecki and his pioneering of hydroponic systems. You can't really see that these plants are grown hydroponically in this picture, but one thing you'll see is that he is doing this outside. And the things that I would say about hydroponics is that you can do this outside. You don't need some sort of grow light or to do this inside to be successful. Some things to think about if you are going to do it outside is that, for example, it rains. And I've grown hydroponically outside in certain systems. The rain does cause a problem. It can cause flooding of your hydroponic system. And then similarly, we do here, at least in Northern Virginia, get thunderstorms with high winds. And a lot of times these plants are supported by this growth media that we'll talk about, but they are in fact not as physically embedded into that media since their roots are dangling in water as a plant would be in soil. And so I have come out after a storm and seen most of my plants that were grown hydroponically, particularly larger plants, toppled over. So I think if you are going to pursue this outside, I'm happy to discuss that or answer any questions about that. But what I would tend to focus on are plants that are smaller in physical size. Lettuce, things like that may be good options to do that. And here's a picture from the Ascension Islands in April of 1945. This also was a hydroponic grow facility, again, used to produce food for troops in World War II. What are some advantages of hydroponic gardening? Well, first and foremost, it basically allows for gardening where agriculture is not possible, especially in-ground agriculture. So you could do this in a desert climate. You could do this. You could also grow right indoors at any time of the year when basically regular gardening isn't feasible. Especially indoors, it allows for a more complete control of the growing environment. And today we'll talk about the appropriate humidity level, the appropriate temperature, the appropriate pH level, the appropriate nutrient composition. And all these things, I say that it kind of makes it akin to sending your plant to the spa for a weekend. It's the ideal environment for a plant to thrive. And because you're controlling all the elements, then you can dial in which of those elements you want to be completely optimized for the outcome that you want to achieve. A lot of these systems you'll see are what are called closed systems, which means they recycle water and nutrients within the system itself. And that actually lowers the amount of water and fertilizer that you would need compared to other hydroponic systems, sure, but also even soil-based growing. In fact, one of the systems we'll talk about today is what's called an aeroponic system, and the space station actually uses an aeroponic system to cultivate fresh vegetables on the space station using basically recycled water from various sources on the space station itself. You will get faster growth. One of the central components that we'll talk about today too is that, you need to provide oxygen to the system. That is typically done through an aquarium air stone or some sort of air pump. And that available oxygen actually allows the roots to grow more rapidly, and therefore the plant grows more rapidly. Because you're growing inside or in a closed, controlled system, really you're reducing the opportunity for various pests, particularly insects, certain types of fungus and bacteria, and their ability to come in and cause problems with your plants. Much higher yields are achieved with this method, in part because you're doing so much optimization to the plant's environment. A lot of us spend time weeding our garden. There is no weeding involved, which is good. A lot of commercial operations claim that this leads to lower labor costs. A lot of these facilities are able to grow things vertically, as an example. So you can think if somebody's growing strawberries vertically, then they don't have to have people bending over. It actually allows for more rapid harvesting of the crops themselves. You don't need to rotate the crops because you are basically changing the nutrient solution each time through each growth cycle. And transplant shock is reduced. When you are growing a seedling and then you move them to this environment, you basically wait and you'll see the roots go down from the hydroponic basket. And really, the moment they begin to hit that nutrient solution, it's kind of off to the races. And so this really isn't a big concern to control for in my experience. I would also say that you can transplant things from hydroponics to soil. I tend to germinate all of my seeds hydroponically. I get incredible results with that. But once the roots have emerged from the grow sponge that I use to germinate the seeds hydroponically, they're basically ready to be transplanted into soil. And they just take a little bit to adjust, but then they go along just fine. Disadvantages. There is some initial and operational costs that are associated with this, and we'll go into that. And they are higher than gardening with soil. In particular, if you're going to do something indoors, there is certainly what I would characterize as a relatively high initial equipment cost. However, right, much of the equipment that you would purchase lasts for many, many, many years. And so if this is a hobby that you're interested in, the kind of moderate investment up front would be well worth it, and it would ultimately pay dividends. Also, some of these things can increase your utility costs because of the amount of power that you're drawing to operate certain types of, for example, kind of grow lights necessary for really robust plant growth. You do need to have some knowledge of these processes, and then hopefully after today, you'll have enough maybe to get started. And then also, when there is a problem, when there is I mentioned that, fungal and bacterial disease, the chances of these happening are incredibly reduced compared to outdoor or soil-based growing. But when you do get a problem, and I think this goes back to my statement that just like if there is a pH issue in hydroponics versus a pH issue in soil, when something takes hold in hydroponics, it can spread very, very quickly through a system, and it can actually be fairly destructive to the plant that you're growing. So when you have a problem, it is a major problem. But a lot of plant varieties have been bred to be resistant, and you just have to do certain things that we'll talk about to try to control for those kind of disease processes taking hold. So getting into some different types of hydroponic systems, they can either be what are called liquid or aggregate. So liquid systems have no supporting medium for the plant roots, whereas aggregate systems tend to be what I've utilized. Hydroponic systems are further characterized as open. So once the nutrient solution is delivered to the roots, it is not reused, or closed, where the surplus solution is recovered, replenished, and recycled. And you'll see some of the systems where that is occurring on the subsequent slides. And this is a picture of one of the local hydroponic facilities, Area 2 farms here in Arlington, Virginia. So here's some examples of some hydroponic growth media that I've had experience with that have worked quite well. On the upper left, these are clay pebbles. And the advantage of this is that it's a very porous clay pebble. So it actually absorbs and holds water. And so when you're growing a plant hydroponically, there's this basket the plant basically sits in. And then these beads go around the plant to physically support it. And then the roots grow through the basket into the hydroponic media. And then on the upper right, it's a cocoa noir. It's like that coconut husk kind of material. It's kind of reminiscent of soil, but it's not soil. And that also works quite well. And then on the bottom right is rockwool cubes. And I've used those as well. That's also a very absorptive material that soaks up a lot of water and nutrient solutions. The rockwool, I would say I've also done kind of the mix of using the rockwool cube to germinate a seed. Then once the plant got started, covered the rest of it with those clay pebbles, and that works quite well as well. So the first system we're going to talk about is called a wick system. You'll see that there's an air pump with an air stone oxygenating this nutrient solution. And then the plants are sitting in a tray that are basically have that medium. And that medium could be any of those things that I just mentioned. It could be that rock wool, it could be those clay pebbles, that cocoa noir. And then up into the tray are wicks. Through capillary action, the nutrient solution is drawn up and then into that tray of media to saturate it and then provide nutrients and water to the plant. This is probably one of the most basic hydroponic systems that you could create. It doesn't require a lot of work. The only real place for equipment failure here would be a failure of your air pump, and that failure would not be catastrophic. It would take a long time of not having oxygenation in your system for you to observe that there was some sort of problem. And because it's just capillary action, it would continue to work and probably would preserve a lot of the water and nutrient solution over time. I personally don't have experience with these systems, but they are widely used. Now, this next system is called the water culture. I refer to it as deep water culture. This is the system I probably have the most experience with. Again, there's an air pump oxygenating an air stone to oxygenate the nutrient solution. And here, basically, the plant sits on a platform and the roots basically grow into the nutrient reservoir and absorb the water, absorb the nutrient solution, and grow. It works incredibly well. Here is a picture of my indoor cultivation center and deep water culture that I've made using 5-gallon buckets. And you can see here, these are 2 pepper plants, and you can see the robustness of their growth. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the things I have in this picture. You see the top, there's the 4x4 grow light. It works quite well. We'll talk about grow lights here in a little bit. You see an oscillating fan. That's very, very important to keep air circulating in this enclosed space. There is, of course, a grow tent, which provides a reflective surface for the light and then also helps increase the rate and the effectiveness of that grow light. And then here in Virginia, it can be rather humid. And also, these plants are actively transpiring. And so a dehumidifier is often needed for me to maintain appropriate humidity levels. Basically, those plants are sitting in a lid that has a recess in it. It's kind of a netted basket in the center of that lid. They're sitting in those clay pebbles. Those roots are going down into a nutrient solution that is being oxygenated. Here's another system that I made, which was also a lot of fun. Here I bought these storage containers for about $10 at Costco, and then basically got a drill bit with a 2-inch saw on it and drilled these holes into the top of it, and then put these little baskets. And these little baskets are about 2 inches wide, and you can see those clay pebbles sitting in them. And I was able to get about 15 plants per container. And then you see these are green beans and Swiss chard. And again, the plants grow the roots into this system. There's a lot more nutrient solution into these. It's obviously, I think it's about 27 gallons of nutrient solution into these. The Swiss chard lasted me several months of cutting. I was harvesting on average about every other day to every 3 days and pulling a freezer bag full of Swiss chard every time I harvest. The green beans is an example. I have a family of four. We had about 3 meals of green beans from that before they kind of puttered out. Instead of doing your own, there are also commercially available systems. And I'm not going to provide an advertisement for any of them, but this is an example of one that I also have. Here you can see a bunch of lettuce growing. One of the advantages of these systems that are commercially available, right? It's set up, it's a lot more straightforward because there's instructions and best practices that are all laid out for you. And I've had a lot of success with these types of systems. And same deal here. You're harvesting lettuce about every other day, every 3 days, and then again, pulling probably a half to a 3/4 of a freezer bag full of lettuce every day. I haven't bought a bag of salad greens in probably 5 years. Pros and cons of commercial systems. This is an excellent way if you feel like, wow, this is beyond my capability. It's an excellent way to get into hydroponics. The systems run themselves, they're set up, they actually have reminders like when to add water, when to add nutrients, and then also they're way less labor intensive. I mentioned the automated reminders. Their nutrient solutions have been buffered, so you don't have to pH them. You just basically follow their instructions and add how much they say to add, and you'll be fine. The only, I think, downside of these is that you can see it's much smaller. I started with these commercial systems and really loved it, but I started feeling limited on the types of different plants I could grow. I didn't just want to grow lettuce. I didn't just want to grow things that were only going to be under 2 foot tall. I wanted to kind of expand and see what I could do. If you want to grow tomatoes or peppers or cucumbers or anything like that, these systems aren't going to probably physically accommodate that. Here's also one just as an example. There's a tabletop one that you can get, and it's got 5 or 6 places for plants in it. It grows very nicely too. Just pointing it out that if these other systems seem too large or inaccessible to you, maybe think about getting started with something simple and grow just a few different herbs on your kitchen counter and see how it works. Another type of system is called the ebb and flow hydroponic system. And this one is a little bit more complex. There's a nutrient reservoir that works on a pump, and that pump activates on a timer to go off, let's say, every 15 minutes per hour. It floods the tray that you have with your plants in it, and then it gets recycled back into the nutrient reservoir, and then that cycle continues over and over again. The advantages of this is that in those intermittent times when your plant is not being exposed or flooded with nutrients, it's exposed to oxygen and increased amounts of oxygen. And that promotes a great deal more lateral root growth. And so you can see that these plants have just these massive root structures on them. The disadvantages, right, is, I mentioned mechanical failure. There's more places for this type of system to have a mechanical failure. One of which is, in addition to having an oxygenated system, you're having water pumps that could fail, your timers could fail. And one of the things that you'll see is that oftentimes the nutrient solution is piped into the tray, it goes through a tube. And if something were to happen, for example, one of these clay pellets get into the tube and clog the system, the results could be, frankly, catastrophic to your grow system. I've used these systems, and I've used one similar to this. This is an example of what one looks like. You see that barrel in the back is the reservoir, and you see all those tubes coming out of it. So there's a pump that sits in that reservoir and then pumps the nutrients into those various buckets, floods them, and then pumps them back into that central reservoir chamber. And exactly what I described happened. One of those clay pebbles got into one of those pipes and clogged the system. And then I came down one morning and looked at my plant, and it was not in a good place. So I think these systems are really cool. I would probably recommend them for probably people that were more advanced and probably maybe even people that were doing kind of these commercial operations. Another really common system is what's called a drip system, and it's very widely used. Here you also see an air pump oxygenating a nutrient reservoir, and then you have a water pump that is then pumping up into a basically a manifold that then drips the nutrient solution into the medium and into the tray where your plants are growing. This is another great hydroponic method. Again, the plants aren't sitting in soil, they're sitting in, for example, that clay pebble media, and the solution is being dripped down at a defined interval into that tray that is then promoting their growth. And also, it's able to recycle those nutrients because any overflow or excess watering that's going down can flow back into the nutrient reservoir. Again, the only thing I would point out, right, anything that revolves on a pump for watering would be subjected to potential mechanical failure. Another system, and this is more common in commercial operations, is something called the nutrient film technique. So here, the tray that actually grows the plants is sitting at a little bit of an angle, kind of draining down. The nutrient solution is pumped up and then floods the reservoir and then basically runs down to a drain and then is returned. So this is a closed system that continues to recirculate the nutrient solution, and it basically constantly goes. So there's no timer required for the submersible pumps. It's just constantly flowing water. There are systems where you see large PVC pipes with like numerous plants in them. They'll either use this system or something called an aeroponic system. So aeroponics is a system in which the roots are continuously or discontinuously kept in an environment where they're being sprayed with an aerosol. So the nutrient solution goes through a pipe, and then there's a sprayer that basically mists the plant roots at a defined interval. And I have a picture of this on a subsequent slide. So again, the advantage is that when that spraying is not happening, the roots are growing in air. So there's increased oxygenation, increased lateral root growth. And then you're also minimizing the amount of water and nutrients that you're using to grow these plants because you're spraying a mist at really kind of defined intervals. This is a great method, and it's one that's often used in both commercial growing. And then again, this is the method that I mentioned was used on the space station. In real life, in local life, these systems are used. This building's at 1100 Wilson Boulevard in Roslyn. This garden here is an aeroponic garden, and there's probably pipes behind each one of these plants that have spray nozzles on them that are going off at defined frequencies to spray these plants. You could also build your own. I built one. This is mine, and this works really well. I have a picture at the question section of what the results look like. But here I put an aquarium water pump, a small water pump at the base of this container, and then used a half-inch PVC pipe with some connectors and connected this manifold together. And then added, you can buy these little sprayers on Amazon for a few dollars, and then drilled some holes into the PVC pipe, installed these different sprayers. The different colors just kind of indicates the direction, whether it's 180 or 360 that these things spread. Plugged it in, and this was my hallelujah moment when it actually worked, and it basically mists up onto the plants. And I set this for 15 minutes every hour, and so far this is my first time doing it, but the results have been really, really surprising and fantastic. And the level of water and nutrients that are needed is much, much lower than, for example, the deep water culture system that I have a lot more experience with. And this is the result of that. So here I'm growing a bunch of lettuces and some basil, and this is in that aeroponic system. And it's actually turned out quite well. I'm also harvesting about every other day, every 3 days with this system, and I've been very happy with it. So I just gave you a lot on a lot of different hydroponic systems. So I think we're going to pause here and see if there's any immediate questions before we proceed with the remainder of the presentation.
Yes, we have a number of questions. Some are about specific elements of the system, and some are once the system has gotten going. So we'll start with the ones that are about like specific elements of the system. So one of the questions is just about the air stone and how does the air stone work?
The air stone I typically buy, you can buy an aquarium air stone for like fish. Some of them look like a cylinder, some of them look like a disc, but the main part of the stone is just this porous rock material. And then there's a nub at the end that you plug a small rubber hose onto. And then that hose goes and connects to an air pump that you plug in. And it's an aquarium air pump, what you would use to oxygenate water for fish. And then the air pump pumps air, pumps it through into that air stone, and then creates little bubbles. And those bubbles are more than sufficient to oxygenate the water.
Sort of along those lines, we have a question about the wick and what the wick is made of and whether it's hollow or not.
I don't have a ton of experience with these systems, but I think the wick is more like an absorptive rope, like an actual wick. It doesn't have holes in it. It's actually an absorbing material that is able to suck up the water and become saturated and then disperse it into the growing media.
And then with the clay pebbles, with the rock wool, are these materials reusable? Do they break down? What's the lifespan of those
Yeah.
parts of it?
Rock wool, I probably wouldn't reuse. Every time I've used it, it starts breaking down. If I were to send you an endorsement of which material to use, my go-to is the pebbles. I like the pebbles a lot. Yes, you can recycle them. There is a method of cleaning them, and you can basically soak them in like a bleach solution or a hydrogen peroxide solution to clean them. I used to be fairly religious about that, and then I kind of started getting a little lazy and I started cleaning them less, and I still haven't had any issues that I could attribute to the pebbles. In my life of doing this, I bought one gigantic bag of pellets and I have not yet bought another. Once a grow is done, I try to cut the plant off and get rid of it, and then I try to dig out all those pebbles so I don't lose them. Some of them adhere to the plant and the root system and I don't bother, so there's a little bit of loss, but I try to recycle those. And then things you want to do, right? You want to probably pass them through water 2 or 3 times, get rid of the roots around them, clean off any debris. And then if you really wanted to be diligent about it, then yeah, a low percentage hydrogen peroxide solution or a low percentage bleach solution, and then subsequent rewatering to dilute it back out would be sufficient to probably clean them.
How long can an indoor system be left unattended? Specifically, it looks like they're asking about vacation. So,
Yeah.
can you do a long weekend? Can you go away for a week? Like what's your limit here?
It depends on what you're growing and where you're growing it. And I think you'll get accustomed, right? You'll see what the plant is doing. Early on, if you start something, you could go on vacation and come back and you'll be fine. Like those pepper plants that you saw in that 5 gallon bucket, they definitely need water after like 2 days. They probably will drink and use at least a third of what's in that bucket over the course of a day. So when I do those bucket systems, I'm typically going every day to give them a little bit more water to top off the system. For those like commercially available systems or for these aeroponic systems, if you're growing smaller plants, they're going to need less water. I think you'd have much more flexibility to do that. For the aeroponic system, they're not using as much nutrients or water. So I think that's safe. So I think you kind of have to get a feel of it. For some, yes, I would say you could definitely do that. I probably wouldn't grow something hydroponically if you were going to go out of town for 2 weeks. You probably wouldn't come back to something that you would be very proud of. But I think you just have to kind of see how much water is being utilized.
Another question we have is about water roots versus soil roots, which I know you and I talked about this a little bit earlier in the week, and whether water roots are more delicate, how much difficulty would they have adjusting to soil?
And I can only speak from my personal experience. So as I mentioned, I start most of my seeds in soil. And for that, there's these little sponges that I didn't, I guess, really talk about, but you'll see a picture of it at the next break section. They're these little brown, kind of smaller sponges that you put the seed in, then it grows. Before you transplant, you want to make sure that there are roots coming out of that system. You don't want to wait too long because if the roots get into the hydroponic system, they actually can start tangling with the other plants in the system, and then you're going to have to rip roots to get it out, and nobody wants to do that. When they're young like that, I have never seen any problem moving a plant from that system into a soil-based system. I have never had an issue with that. I've had a couple plants last year. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of the pepper, the Aji charapita. It's a pepper plant from Peru that I really like the peppers. And I grew plants and they actually just exploded in my tent and they just got so big that I couldn't keep them in there anymore. And so it was summer, so I was like, I'm going to move them out. And so I actually took that hydroponic lid and took it off and put those into a big 25-gallon grow bag. And I put it in soil. It did not look great for a while. I had to be very judicious about how long I kept it in the sun. It was like a long transition period, but I had kept moving into the shade, would move it out in the sun for a little bit, then move it back in the shade. It seemed like it wanted a lot of water for a really long time, but
Mhm.
eventually it survived and it produced fruit. I had a ton of those peppers at the end of the day. I think it's much easier to transplant when they're younger. I think when they're established in the hydroponic and it's like a full-grown plant getting ready to flower, you could still do it, but I think it's going to require a lot of energy on your part to make sure that the plant survives that shock.
And then we just have a couple questions that are about creating the system, building the system. One was with the DIY container, the Home Depot containers, and if you could have some explanation about how to set up that container for something like green beans.
So I use this kind of container. I drilled those holes in it. YouTube is also your friend. There's a lot of great people doing cool stuff on YouTube. But for that, those green beans, I basically put a green bean seed into those clay pellets and then put those baskets in. The key is that you want the nutrient solution to be kind of barely touching, not flooding, but barely touching the bottom of those baskets. Because those clay pebbles will then, through capillary action, will absorb all of the nutrient solution and become saturated. I had pretty good success germinating those green bean plants. I think I had to go back and maybe redo it again for a couple of the 15. So it wasn't spectacular germination rates, but it was pretty good. And so that's how you would do it. In the next section, we're going to get into how to do this and things to look at. I basically provide a setup of how you would do the bucket system, but that generally would be translatable to one of these containers. So, various types of vegetables you could grow and what you probably shouldn't grow. In general, herbs, lettuce, spinach, green, tomatoes, you can also grow. Would advise to use a determinate variety versus indeterminate because of just the physical constraints on the size, particularly indoors. Also, because you're not really rigorously supporting the root system, if you get a tomato vine that's 6 feet tall, you might get a little top heavy. Peppers work great. I've done strawberries, those work great. Peas, again, if you have something that's vining, it could be a little unwieldy and you may have trouble controlling it, getting it underneath your light. So dwarf varieties may be of interest. Bush beans, not pole beans, work great. Swiss chard, cucumbers, the self-pollinating versions are easy. Having the type that you don't have to mate male and female flowers is probably best. Microgreens, fantastic. What's really not recommended is anything that's a root vegetable. They can't grow into that solution. You're not going to like it. It's not going to turn out well. Onions don't work well. I've never tried corn, and this is just actually something I've read that corn's not recommended either. But for the most part, there's a lot of options that you can pick from in terms of growing different types of vegetables. You can also grow flowers. You can also do other things. As long as there's space, there's room for to do house plants. There's room to do marigolds, petunias, daisies, orchids, carnations. I have done some flowers once. It's part of a requirement for my kids. So he's in Boy Scouts. He did the gardening merit badge and he had to grow flowers in addition to vegetables. So we did flowers hydroponically. It works great, turns out fine, but don't have a lot of experience doing these sorts of things. Here's the equipment to get started. If you were going to do a DIY deep water culture system, this would be like the system that I had those pepper plants in. A 5 gallon bucket that's black or painted black. The reason for this, if it's not opaque, then light gets in. And if light gets in, then algae can grow. And algae is not your friend in a hydroponic system. It actually takes oxygen away from hydroponics and can cause problems. Hydroponic bucket lids or the baskets. And you saw those two different sides of baskets. You couldn't really see that lid, but it's basically a bucket lid with a recessed center that's kind of netted. You can get those on Amazon. Those little 2-inch baskets, you can get those on Amazon. A grow light. If you're going to grow inside, you need to have a light source to be able to do that. Timers are optional, but timers really help. So you don't have to remember when to turn your lights off, or if you have a more complicated system with pumps, you don't have to remember to turn the pump on. I have multiple timers that I use all the time to help. It's fantastic. Fans to circulate air. This is really important in a indoor environment to prevent disease and pests. I recommend getting an electric toothbrush, and this is to be the bee. And we'll talk about this, but this is the way that you can get a lot of these plants to pollinate more efficiently. is using kind of a mechanical method to induce pollination. An aquarium air pump with the air stone and the tubing, and we talked about that. Nutrients, we'll cover what to do there. Depending on where you are, you might need a dehumidifier or a humidifier. And we'll talk about humidity, but generally you want humidity between 40 and 60% relative humidity. So if you're in a desert and trying to do this, you may need a humidifier to get that level. But if you're here in Virginia, you're definitely going to need a dehumidifier. One of the things we'll talk about is the nutrients and how often to change them. You typically need to change the nutrients. A good rule of thumb is about every 2 weeks. And so to do that, if you were using a bucket, for one of those larger containers, you probably could go a lot longer than that since there's gallons of nutrients in there. But a siphon could be used to basically remove the nutrient solution into another bucket and then replace it without having massive disruptions of the root bed. The growth medium we discussed. And then if you really wanted to try to optimize for pH, there's various pH solutions that are pH up, pH down, that help you kind of dial in that optimum pH. Here's a list of basically what this would cost. You're looking at a few $100s of cost to get started, which is much more expensive than a regular soil-based garden. But if this is a hobby that you're interested in, it really may be worth it for you. So grow lights. Pro tip, do not skimp on a grow light. It's an investment. Spend the money. You don't want a sun that's operating at 25% power. And so basically in an indoor environment, this light is the sunlight. And so you don't need to go all out, but you want to make sure that you're buying something that is going to last a long time and provide you the level of robustness that you're going to need from the light in order to effectively grow plants in a way that you want to. They typically come in two different forms, LED or high pressure sodium or fluorescent. A full spectrum LED light is ideal for plant growth. There are some that have dimmers that can control the blue or the red spectrum of that light. The blue or violet light promotes vegetative growth. Red light promotes budding or flowering. I don't usually mess with the spectrum. At one point, I was growing something under primarily red light, and what I noticed was the plants didn't get very big before they started flowering. So I would just do full spectrum. In terms of looking for a light, one of the things that you should look for is something is reflective of light intensity. So there's something called PPFD, and that stands for photosynthetic photon flux density. Or even looking at footprint or coverage, you will also see something called PAR, which refers to photosynthetically available radiation. And this is all just a measure, and this is where maybe we get a little technical, of how strong the light is and how much light is going to be available for your plants. Basically, what you need to know is the higher the PPFD, the higher the PAR number, the brighter and more light is going to be available for your plant. On average, I would recommend an optimal PPFD to be between the range of 300 to 600 micromoles per meter squared per second. And then there's also things to look at in terms of efficacy. How efficiently does the light convert power, i.e. electricity into light? So if you're worried about utility costs or the environment, you want to try to look for a light that's going to be more efficient. And then looking at how much space does the light cover? If you're trying to grow plants in a 4-foot space, probably a 12-inch light is not going to do that for you. So you need to think about where you're going to grow your plants, how much space you're going to need. On average, you run these lights for about 14 to 18 hours a day is the appropriate photo period that I would recommend to grow vegetables. So at the top, you'll see some examples of high intensity LED lights. As an example, you saw something very similar to the one on the upper left in my setup. And then you'll also see things online or on Amazon that say, this is an LED grow light, and they look something like this. Those probably aren't going to deliver the type of results that you want. They may keep a plant alive, but it's probably not going to result in the level of growth. You need to understand those parameters of PPFD, of coverage, of efficiency, and understand it really before making that kind of investment, because it's a long-term investment. Fluorescent lights, people will point to them and say, hey, they're a fraction of the cost of LED. Fluorescent lights are fine. They are able to grow plants. But in my experience, LEDs outperform fluorescent in terms of cost and maintenance. LEDs last a much longer time. and then in terms of their ability to actually induce plant health and yield of the plants. So if you're asking me, I'm going to say I go LED every single time. So here's an example of that photosynthetic photon flux density, or PPFD, in action. And so this is a diagram of the actual coverage of the light in the grow space. So this is an open area with no reflective surfaces at two different mounting heights. And by the way, if you buy a grow light that's worth a snuff, online or in its package insert, have this diagram. And it's telling you how bright the light is. You can see here at 2 feet or at 4 feet, the spread of that light. Here's one at 18 inches and one at 24. For this light, I told you the optimal rate is probably between 300 and 600. You probably want to raise that light to about 24 inches for optimal plant growth and results. This one at 18 inches with 1100 at the center may be a little too much for plants. So nutrients recommend changing every 2 weeks. There are a ton of commercially available hydroponic nutrients. Those are typically geared towards the cultivation of one type of plant, and they're shown as either grow or vegetative, and those have higher levels of nitrogen. It promotes growth. The other ones have higher levels of potassium or phosphorus, and those promote flowering. And then there's a micro blend that has all the micronutrients. Those are fine. You maybe could use them, but they're geared again towards, one specific type of plant. I make my own. It's a lot cheaper. I basically use a plant-specific soluble fertilizer. I add some ammonium calcium nitrate to provide a little supplemental nitrogen. And then I add calcium magnesium to provide those divalent cations. And that helps avoid any sort of root rot issues and things like that. And that seems to work well. If anybody has any questions or wants my basic DIY solution, it works great. I haven't had any problems with it. I'm happy to provide it. Photo period, I mentioned 14, 18 hours a day. Some plants require a photo period to induce flowering. That is not the case for most vegetables. I would say the distance from that light typically is about 1 to 2 feet. You saw in that diagram, that's what they were evaluating, about 1.5 to 2 feet. And the things to look for, right? If your plant is not thriving, if it's not growing, or if you see it stretching, kind of getting leggy, trying to move towards the light, move it closer. If you see leaves folding in on themselves, doing like that prayer hands, or the tips of the leaves are burning, then you need to move the light further away. And that's a sign that they're getting enough light and they just can't handle anymore. Environmental conditions, relative humidity between 40 and 60. Why? If it's too low, the pollen doesn't stick to the stigma or the pistil. It basically just falls right through the flower. And then you also are going to get increased transpiration, which is going to increase the amount of water and then ultimately the amount of nutrients that you have to use. It's too moist, the pollen won't get released from the stamen. And so then you're not going to get efficient pollination. You're also, though, too moist is really, really bad because you actually raise the risk of getting some sort of fungal disease. Temperature, you typically want it, I would say 90 is probably too high. You want it actually probably between 70 and 85 degrees in your growing environment. For example, the lettuces I have are actually at a lower temperature. They're about 60 degrees because I'm not putting them in a tent and they're not under real strong lights. They're sitting out and they're doing well, but they're meant to do well in cooler temperatures. Fans, they're a must-have. Use fans that are basically oscillating. The recirculating air helps promote stronger plants and then helps also prevent the onset of disease. Pollination, you want to aid pollination. There's different ways to do this. I find the most effective way is I use an electric toothbrush. It's one of those cheap disposable ones you can buy at Target. I think it has SpongeBob SquarePants on it. And I take this toothbrush and I gently press it on the back of the flower. And then you actually will see the pollen shoot out of the flower. And that is sufficient enough to increase pollination. You can also take the plant, grab it at its base, and kind of gently shake it, and that works as well too. I have dealt with plants that actually needed cross-pollination. It's a lot of work. It's a lot more work than you probably want to do. But in those instances, I've used a Q-tip and then basically dusted one plant and then moved it over to another. The efficiency of that I've noticed was quite a bit lower. So I would try to stick to plants that are self-pollinating. So pH, try to optimize. And I say this because I don't optimize my pH every time. This is one of these things that you need to be aware of if you're in hydroponics, that you need to be aware that this is a factor. One of the things is that hydroponics tends to trend slightly more acidic than soil. So most things in hydroponics typically are between the pH of 5.5 and 6.5, whereas soils maybe 6.5 to 7.2. When you would optimize your pH is that you would pH your nutrient solution before you added it to your reservoir. And some people pH water before they add it to the nutrient solution throughout their grow. Arlington and Alexandria's tap water runs slightly alkaline, 7.3. I have done this and I have not done it. And I have never encountered a problem with nutrient absorption. So take that for what you will. Now, if I lived somewhere where the water system was different, where there was perhaps really hard water with a lot of minerals in it, then this might become a concern. If you encountered a problem, this would be one of the first things that I would look at as to what is the pH of the solution that you're going in to feed your plants with. And it's again, same as soil, right? It's all about optimizing nutrient availability. At certain different pHs, the nutrients become unavailable, and then you won't see robust growth. And this, to a certain extent, is tied to another factor called the electrical conductivity level. In hydroponics, you are adding inorganic salts to water, and that is what is basically feeding the plant. The electrical conductivity level is a measurement of the amount of dissolved minerals, i.e. salts, that you have in your nutrient solution. And they can be expressed as two different measurements, either ppm, parts per million, or millisiemens per centimeter, which is basically the electrical conductivity level. So it measures how much salt you have. Optimal levels of this is generally between 1.2 to 2.4 when the plant is growing, and then about 1.8 to 2.8 when you're actually producing flowers and you're producing vegetables. And just for reference, a lot of these meters that you would use to measure this measure in parts per million. So there would be a simple conversion. 1 millisiemen per centimeter is approximately 640 ppms. So the reason why I'm telling you this is because in addition to pH, the amount of nutrients that are in your solution, the amount of salts that are in your solution can lead to another problem that is called nutrient lock that we'll talk about in the next section. That is where the plant then no longer has the ability to take up too many nutrients, typically because there's either an imbalance in pH or there's an imbalance in your EC level. And there's too many salts in your nutrient solution. And often those two are linked. If your pH drifts off, your plants can't absorb the nutrients. So then the nutrients then become concentrated into the solution and it throws off the system. We'll talk about that in the next section in terms of problems. Here is the brown sponge that I mentioned. This is how I germinate my seeds. It works pretty well. And then here on the right is more Swiss chard. And then I also grew some Chinese broccoli hydroponically. And you can see that those leaves just got crazy, but it turned out pretty well too. So I just went through how to do this. I'm happy to answer any specific questions related to methods before we get into problems.
Just a few questions here. One is about flowers and whether flowers require a different light spectrum as opposed to vegetables.
The time that I grew flowers, which is only once, I grew it under one of those commercially available systems. It was an LED light and it was full spectrum. And I don't know the PPFD of that light, but I don't think it was anything crazy. I think you would be fine in terms of treating the light for flowers the same way that you would treat vegetables. So I think it would be fine to assume that those two are the same.
Couple questions about kits and supplies. I know normally we don't provide, like you said, we're not advertisers. And so, but there have been just a few questions about where they can find the materials that they need.
Yeah.
Beginner kits and supplies.
Yeah. The two systems that I showed that were commercially available were made by Miracle-Gro. And there was a company that they had called AeroGarden that was a division of Miracle-Gro that made these systems. And they were awesome. But last year, they sent out a note saying that they were going out of business because of a lack of demand. It's going to create more work for me because their pre-made nutrient solution is no longer going to be available in the stores. So I'm going to have to figure out how to make a nutrient solution for this, but that'll be a bridge I'll cross when I get there. Beyond that, there are a number of other competitors that have stepped in. A Google search of home hydroponic systems, You'll see that there's these tower gardens. There's certainly these tabletop ones. They are pricey, but they're a great way to get started. I don't have experience with any of those other ones, but I would just do the same thing you would do before you buy anything else. I would look at customer reviews, see what kind of performance they have, and see what kind of customer support they have. That was one of the things about the AeroGarden system that I liked. You could basically return the seeds if they didn't germinate in the system. Those are the things I would just pay attention to. For the DIY system, I mean, you can buy buckets. I bought the buckets online. I bought restaurant grade, food grade buckets. The lids you can buy online. The aquarium pump or aquarium store, you could buy at PetSmart or you could buy online. The pebbles you can order online. The lights, there's a number of commercially available vendors for that. You just would have to just Google that and look. The nutrients, there's a few different companies I've used. Again, not advertising, but the company I really like is one called Greenway Biotech. And it actually has plant-specific soluble fertilizers that are completely dialed in terms of NPK and micronutrients for whatever you're trying to grow. So like I'll pull out my pepper fertilizer when I'm doing peppers and lettuce and herbs when I do lettuce and herbs. And that so far has worked. I've really never had any problem. And they sell the ammonium nitrate, they sell the calcium magnesium. I've never had a problem with the product that I've used, but there are tons of other commercially available options that you could find. Yeah, it just, takes a little digging. Again, it sounds like maybe it would be helpful for me to kind of put together a list of things and places where people could think about acquiring them if people would like that.
One of the questions is about an ebb and flow system and if there's a medium other than pebbles that you can use to prevent clogging. And so I'm not sure if that's one of the troubleshooting things that you're going to go into next, but
Yeah, no, it's not. Yes, there are all sorts of different mediums that you can pick. The plant's set in this kind of cube, a plastic cube that gets flooded, and it actually sat in a grow bag. And the reason why it got clogged is one of those pellets fell over the side of the grow bag and then got into the tube. So, A, if you could just maybe not fill them up as much, maybe that wouldn't happen. But also, you could use that cocoa noir. There's tons of other media that you could potentially use that probably wouldn't have that problem. Now thinking about it, I don't know why I didn't cover that top of that pot. It doesn't need to be exposed to air. You could have covered it and then it maybe would have prevented those pebbles from falling out. Cleanliness. It is very important in hydroponic systems to make sure everything is clean. If there is a pest or a disease, it can really take off and spread in this system because it's a closed environment. And just once it gets hold, it's just really hard to get rid of. As I mentioned, opaque buckets and reservoirs, everything covered, that helps prevent algae growth. And algae can cause a lot of problems in hydroponic systems. The oxygenation of the nutrient fluid actually helps reduce bacterial growth. It also helps keep a degree of, lack of a better term, like turbulence in the water, which also helps prevent bacterial growth. Some folks add a small percentage of hydrogen peroxide into their nutrient reservoir, and this also helps keep diseases at bay. I've done it, I don't do it all the time. Everything you're using, so the bucket or those containers, the tools you're using, just in the same way that they talk about in soil gardening, right? You should be sterilizing those materials fairly frequently. After each grow, I basically wash the buckets in soap and water, and then I actually fill them with a hot water and bleach solution, relatively high percentage bleach, and then kind of let it sit for a little while, dump them out, then rinse the buckets over and over again until, it's diluted out. And then for the tent environment, it's a closed environment. If something were to have happened in there, it could be potentially a feeding ground. There's also, you have to be careful. There's plant matter that drops during the course of growth, whether it's leaves, those need to be swept up and cleaned out. I typically spray a bleach solution all throughout the tent and then wipe it down just to make sure that nothing really can take hold. So this phenomenon of nutrient lock we talked about, that is when the pH and the salt concentration in the water solution gets out of control or out of whack. And what happens is the plant can no longer take up nutrients. And what you'll notice, and what a lot of rookie hydroponics people do, is that they come in and they see that their plant isn't doing well. They'll see that it's kind of yellowing or kind of looks limp, doesn't have that degree of robustness that you saw in these other pictures. And so their first thing that they think about doing is, well, I got to add more nutrient solution. And then what happens is that they're basically adding insult to injury. and they're doubling down on what is the nature of the problem. If you suspect nutrient lock, one of the things I have, I don't use them very often, but I do have an EC meter and I do have a pH meter. And this tells me, wow, if you had an EC level of 3.2, then you know that there's way too much salt in your solution. So what do you do about that? The easiest thing to handle this is actually to kind of take a step back, empty your reservoir, put water in your system, and then take 2 or 3 days to flush the system with just water. That'll get the excess salt out of your plant. It will have taken up enough that it can survive 2 or 3 days with just water. It's kind of rebooting your plant in the system. So if you encounter a problem that looks related to growth and you're concerned about it, the first step I would do is take measurements and see if you can understand where the issue lies. But before you jump to adding more nutrients, the next safest thing you could do would be to just flush your system with water, wait 2 or 3 days, then add nutrients again and see if the problem corrects itself. There are certain critters you can get even in an indoor environment. And I'll say the only problems that I've ever had have been related to when I have introduced soil into my grow tent. And the reason why I did that is that so I germinate all these plants for my summer garden, and then they get into kind of bigger pots, and it's a great environment. So I just load the floor with different pots of peppers and tomatoes and cucumbers and things and keep them in there until it's time to take them out and harden them off. What I've noticed is that anytime soil gets into there, I need to be careful because I've had hydroponic grows get aphids, and there's also a bug called a thrip. I haven't had a thrip problem, but I've had aphids. And then, it's the same thing, right, that you deal with soil, except for, right, with an indoor environment, you got to get ahead of it because there's no predators for those insects. There's no environmental conditions to kind of knock them away. And so they can rapidly take hold. And so using whatever control method you want, some people I've read, they do release ladybugs into their grow tent and let them have at it, or use chemical sprays to control, or just shut the grow down and start over. That's an option too. For fungal pathogens, you can occasionally see them. I have not had really any significant issues with fungus, but I'm pretty diligent about controlling humidity and use fans. But if you were to encounter some sort of blight or fungus, the options at that point really are spray to try to control it, just remove the affected plant and start over. And then for viruses, I actually have had an issue, but I think it was related to the seeds I was cultivating because it was almost immediate that you saw that there was this pathology associated with the plants that from looking online, it looked like it was a virus. In those instances, just start over. It's not worth cultivating something in a controlled environment and then having it risk kind of spreading beyond where you are. So a couple other problems. First of all, if you're growing something inside and you're related on a grow light or you have a water pump, power outages, particularly during thunderstorm season, can cause problems. I don't have a generator. I don't rely on anything. I just kind of do my best to get to muddle through it. If you did lose power and your grow light went off for a day or even probably 2 or 3, you're probably fine. It's really those systems where it's actually, the ebb and flow system where it's flooding the plant to feed it, or those aeroponic systems where it's spraying nutrients. If you didn't have power, plants are going to deteriorate because they're not getting water and they're not getting fed. Two other kind of problems that are really common to think about. Number one is algae, and you can see that on the left there. Your roots, and the other one's called root rot, which is basically a fungal infection. Same way that soil-based plants can get root rot, hydroponic plants can get root rot. And it really doesn't have anything to do with them being in water. It has to do with the presence of a fungal pathogen. Your roots should be white. They should be very white. They should not really have any brown on them in that picture there. And they certainly shouldn't be green. Oxygenation of the solution helps. If you're concerned about root rot, you could add a low percentage of hydrogen peroxide to your system, and you're probably not going to encounter it. With an algae, again, you got to focus on keeping things opaque and not having light get through the system. Root rot, once you have it, it's very difficult to treat. So it's better to try to prevent. So hopefully, after all this, I've left you with that you can use several different types of hydroponic systems for vegetable gardening. These systems can result in improved plant growth and yield. There's a little bit of upfront cost, but you can build your own system for certainly much cheaper than a commercially available one. But the commercial systems have their advantage in the sense that it's kind of all in one kit and there's less kind of guesswork. Your grow light, your PPFD, how intense it is, the environmental controls, the nutrients, the pH, and the electrical conductivity level are all things to think about. Now, to be clear again, I don't take a pH reading every time I do this. I definitely don't take an EC reading every time I do this. If I encountered a problem, those would be the first things that I go to, and that's why I'm explaining them here today. Cleanliness and pest management are important. One of the advantages is there's no squirrels or chipmunks going to get your vegetables if you grow them inside your house. And at the end of the day, you got this. You can do it. I think if anybody's interested in this, it is not that hard to get into, and it's a lot of fun. So I encourage you to give it a shot. Here are the resources, two of which are local that use hydroponics. One of them is more focused on microgreens. The other one is focused on a variety of vegetables. If you haven't taken a tour of Area 2 farms, it's pretty cool. I would recommend that you do that. They give regular tours. And then there's a whole hydroponic situation in Petersburg, Virginia, Virginia State. There's some local experts there that I think also would be a great resource. And then just to remind you, this talk was sponsored by the Master Gardeners in Northern Virginia. There's going to be, I think, a survey at the end of this. Nicole may remind you of that, but please fill it out and give your feedback. And I think if there's any additional resources that would be helpful to you in getting into hydroponics, let me know, and I'm happy to answer any questions or provide any additional information.
Thank you so much, Joe. I, for one, have learned a ton looking through the comments. I think a lot of other people have as well and are inspired to try this. So thank you again for a fantastic talk. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today.